안녕하십니까.
Good morning. I am Lee Ji-hye, Assistant Curator of MMCA. I would like to welcome you to the Superhumanity Symposium co-organized by MMCA and e-flux architecture. We will soon start session 2 of our symposium, which will talk about psychopathology. I would like to invite everybody to take their seats. Our symposium is interpreted simultaneously. For Korean, please set your receivers to channel 1, channel 2 for English. I would like to ask everyone to turn off their cell phones or put them in silent mode. And yesterday and today, our symposium is broadcast live on Facebook and YouTube. I would like to introduce Nick Axel, Deputy Editor of e-flux Architecture, who will introduce our speakers. Please give him a big hand.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you. Welcome to the second day of Superhumanity Seoul. I'm very happy to welcome you to the first panel with the theme of psychopathology. So, if one of the theses of the third Istanbul Design Biennial and Superhumanity was that the world designs the human and the human designs the world, this panel will be looking at what happens when these two gestures of moving out from the self and from the human and into the self are, let's say, not in sync with each other. And we're looking at this friction between the human and the world, despite their mutual designs. So we have three panelists and three presentations today. First, we will have Mark Wasiuta, who is a curator, architect, and writer who co-directs the critical, curatorial, and conceptual practices in architecture at Columbia University, GSAP. Then we will have Hong Sungook, who teaches at the program in History and Philosophy of Science at the Seoul National University. And thirdly, we will have Hannah Proctor, who is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute of Cultural Inquiry in Berlin. I'd like to welcome Mark to the stage and give him all a round of applause. Thank you.
Hey, hello. Thanks for coming out. Thanks, Nick, for the introduction. And thanks, Chue, and the Superhumanity group for inviting me here. It's the Superhumanity project is so great, and I'm excited to be taking part, but also slightly annoying because it means I have to pay attention to e-flux again. There was a moment when you could ignore all the e-flux announcements. Now you have to pay attention again. The talk I'm giving is based on work that I did with a couple of collaborators, Florencia Alvarez and Marco Sanchez, last year for the third Istanbul Design Biennial, and that project was called Detox USA. So I'll get started. This is an image of Naples, and amidst all of the details, I'm interested in what can't be seen here. The 2012 article, Airborne Psychotropic Substances Monitored in 8 Big Italian Cities, reported that the air over Italy is congested with chemical traces and particulates of nicotine, marijuana, cocaine, and other drugs. This and other aerial drug particulate studies point to a new confluence of atmospheric science and narcotic regulation, and to overlapping scenes of chemical monitoring and control. Through atmospheric drug testing, air has become forensic in that it delivers particulate evidence of illegal drug trade below, and it now appears as the demonstration of our collective self-medication. Global air is a vast exhalation of THC, cocaine, opiates, and other psychotropic supplements. The air over Italy was measured more than a decade after a similar study discovered traces of cocaine and other narcotics alongside pollutants in Los Angeles smog. And it's not so surprising to find Los Angeles at the forefront of aerial drug testing. After the first national air pollution symposium held in 1959. This is an image from that symposium. And its smog alerts of the 1950s, LA has been closely identified with its air quality. the conception and image of LA air has progressively cohered as a receptacle of contaminants, as an active corrosive agent, and as the generator of LA's hazy atmospheric refraction. And here we're looking at an image of smog police testing the density of smog emissions in LA in the 50s. The coming into visibility of pollutants, the techniques of air measurement, the analysis of harm to the city's population, and the emergence of regulation and governmental action shaped the history of what Marco Sanchez and I have been calling Los Angeles's air urbanism. But to return to Naples for a second, its air urbanism would also entail a history of not only what is happening in its narcotic airspace, but also images such as this, which is clearly from the same vantage, showing Vesuvius erupting, a painting from 1836. And so here we see the cloud of this eruption as the sign of a circulation between the air and what is happening on the ground. So it's a type of aesthetic and visual coding, but it's also then a sign of how air is made informational. In the case of LA, suspended cocaine, heroin, and other narcotics, the monitoring of the airspace overlaps with other sites of chemical testing that have also made Los Angeles the ground zero for a culture of self-improvement and narcotic detoxification. And this other dimension of chemical information is what I'm going to focus on today. By association with a history of Southern California rehabilitation centers from the Betty Ford Clinic, which is what we're looking at here. This is Betty Ford on the left with then President Gerald Ford. And in response to the current wave of addiction, Los Angeles is the nucleus of an expanding American territory of drug addiction centers and clinical detox resorts. These clinics and the analysis of aerial pollutants together belong to processes of contamination and purification that became increasingly legible in the post-war. Together, they signal a toxic economy that encompasses habits, consciousness, morality, legislation, as well as pollutants and environmental controls. Through rehabilitation clinics and detox centers, the administration of the post-war environment entered the body, dividing chemically altered from purified citizens. The most visible of these bodies belong to people like Lindsay Lohan, who have become celebrity exemplars of the chemically altered existence that Avital Ronald describes as being on drugs. Yet for all their clients, detox centers offer a clinical process and a form of appetite management. Detox spans methadone cures and kale smoothies. And as our list of contemporary addiction expands from drugs to sex to love to porn and phones, so do approaches to therapy and to healing experiences. Although Lohan was the most visible guide to this detox territory, her 6 stints in rehab barely hint at its scale. There are now more than 12,000 rehabilitation centers in the United States and tens of thousands of detoxification retreats around the world. In the USA, the rise of detoxification is in part driven by the surge of drug courts that now mandate voluntary rehabilitation in place of incarceration. So detox centers are the experimental therapeutic extension of the American carceral network. Around Malibu, California, there are 34 of these clinics. They're lodged within conventional, albeit dramatically luxurious homes that are leased for the purpose of care and curing addiction. So just to look at some examples, this is Cliffside, Elevations Rehab, Summit Rehab, The Canyon, and Malibu Beach Recovery. But one of the curiosities is that California lease law limits what can be done in these homes to a maximum of 6 beds per building. So this produces in these clinics an unexpected intimacy and domesticity. Despite this, the use and the logic of the house is curiously modified. Group therapy halls replace living rooms, experimental neurological therapy chambers fill garages, and closets and pantries become replacement medication dispensaries. In Malibu, drug addiction, often born within domestic space, is then also treated within domestic space. A therapeutic ethos penetrates even the most banal aspects of domestic life. In some clinics, patients eat meals designed for therapeutic benefit in the company of psychologists and counselors. Bedrooms are shared to foster mutual reinforcement and observation, and the correlation between behavior and space, a fundamental premise of environmental and behavioral psychology, implicates the bedrooms, hallways, bathrooms, and dining rooms of the clinics. The result in these centers is that domesticity is then also reconditioned. One consequence of new health, what we're looking at here is a pavilion in the Canyons Recovery Center 12-step path. So 12-step is literally turned into a kind of landscape design device, which just reinforces this idea that the entire environment and atmosphere of these clinics is inscribed with a therapeutic logic, and sometimes, in an incredibly literal way. One consequence of new health insurance policy is that rehabilitation is often compressed from the standard of 90 days, what used to be the standard of 90 days, to 30 days. And so this poses an incredible challenge to the clinics and the therapists. And so the array of therapies and techniques during this shortened stay expands to fill almost every hour of the patient's lives. No aspect of these clinics, from view to landscape to diet to bed linens, is not considered for its therapeutic effect. The clinics, then, are the condensation and compaction and crystallization of therapy in its spatial and material form. And this atmosphere of therapy touches on bodies directly and sometimes invasively. In the clinics, urine samples are tested for chemical traces and drug metabolites. And this is because rehabilitation is organized around evacuating transgressive and harmful chemicals. Other forms of testing, from brain scans to neurological assessment, are added to urine testing. And at one extreme, these are processes of intimate corporal care. At the other, they indicate a broad cultural and biopolitical regime of drug control. And at both ends of the spectrum, patients are classified in relation to chemical additives and behaviors and identified according to pathological vectors of social, technical, sexual, and narcotic subjectification and addiction. And while patients' bodies are monitored as a site of chemical accumulation, core rehab therapies are combined to treat underlying psychological causes of addiction. Administered by teams of psychiatrists and therapists, primary clinical approaches are founded on varieties of cognitive behavioral therapy, other intensive individual psychotherapies, family therapy, group therapies, and 12-step-based techniques, such as these images illustrate. But around this core of conventional therapies radiates a complex pattern of alternative and experimental therapies, many of these from somatic experiencing to acupuncture, aquatherapy, and yoga, attempt to remedy trauma and construct new bridges between behavior and corporal experience. Others, such as equine therapy, focus on establishing bonds through empathy training, or massage therapy through somatic memory. And even more innovative techniques have emerged, such as EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, which combines talk therapy and eye movement to excavate repressed and troubling memories, or this, which is neural oscillation. So as these therapies proliferate, and as the period of therapy is reduced, there's ever more pressure on the clinics to deliver evidence of the efficacy of therapy. And in a sense, this pressure drives the proliferation of techniques. In the clinics, addiction is generally theorized as an overdetermined condition requiring an expanded repertoire of therapy responses. And as the schedule, variety, and categories of therapy accumulate, the boundary between the space of therapy and the space of life erodes until an image of total environmental therapy begins to appear. This is an image from the project we did in Istanbul, trying to identify the spaces within some of these clinics and how they're used and transformed into spaces of therapy throughout the day. It's a kind of 24-hour space clock of therapy sessions at one of these centers. So the Malibu Recovery Centers provide the setting and the clinical apparatus for this total environmental therapy. Withdrawal is their primary spatial and therapeutic device. It simultaneously describes the physiological response to drug cessation, patient sequestration, and the center's physical isolation on the Malibu cliffs, itself considered and marketed as a form of therapy. While these clinics have appeared because of the detox market and new legislation, there is also a history that has influenced their growth and form. Via a therapeutic imaginary locked onto the California coast, the new clinics are linked to the rural retreats, centers, and institutes that gained popularity in California in the 1960s and 1970s. The Malibu Center's clinical environment, in essence, merge with a West Coast landscape marked and inflected by association with the psychedelic sublime of growth centers such as Esalen and other early California retreats. And I'm not going to talk much about these, but just to give some examples, this is an early health retreat, 1940s and 50s, south of San Diego, called La Puerta. Oops. Sandstone retreat, famous nudist colony of the 60s and 70s that became the locale for Guy Talise's Thy Neighbor's Wife. I guess you've come across this. Or even earlier, the Bohemian Grove, which everybody understands, all paranoid conspiracy theorists think of this as the real space of American power. And so these are all important antecedents to the Malibu clinics, yet the one I want to talk about a little bit more is Esalen, which we're looking at here. This is an image of it in the 1950s. Esalen was founded in 1962 by Stanford University psychology graduates Michael Murphy and Dick Price. And the Esalen Institute quickly emerged as the West Coast Center of Behavior Modification. It was guided by psychologists Fritz Perls, who's on the top, Abraham Maslow in the middle, and influenced by Aldous Huxley and psychedelic activist Timothy Leary. The Institute experimented with chemicals, consciousness, and new forms of therapy that became the conceptual armature and the working methods of the human potential movement. It was associated with other celebrity figures like Bucky Fuller or celebrities like Steve McQueen. Almost everyone landed there at some point in the 60s and 70s. The roster of therapies that organized life at the Institute combined meditation, Eastern mysticism, nudity, sex, and drugs. Indeed, the proliferation of therapies that became the signature of Esalen was initially invented and scripted through drug experimentation, seemingly in agreement with Timothy Leary's claim that a politics of ecstasy demanded its own psychedelic work. The workshops at Esalen relied on LSD as a basic tool for enhancing consciousness and fostering psychic growth. Drug-induced mysticism and other early seminars underscored an LSD orientation and established Esalen's integration of psychedelic vision and therapeutic imagination. Art historian Diederik Diederiksen relates early 1960s psychedelic vision to a more encompassing psychedelic disposition. This is more a perceptual attitude than a hallucination. And this disposition might liberate both LSD trippers and straight observers from the annoyance, distraction, and what he calls the hiss of the capitalist world. Not only would it allow subjects to fall free from the grip of mechanisms of everyday social control, so too would objects fall out of their ordinary place in the world to become suddenly strange, decontextualized, pure objects. So this is his rendition of something of the relationship to objects through LSD perception. But he also talks about how this disposition did fixate and might fixate on landscapes. And he uses Robert Smithson's relationship to landscapes as an example. Robert Smithson, who sees in these landscapes, following something like Diederiksen's psychedelic disposition, a pure terrain free of purposes and use. But the liberating detachment of this vision, this disposition, would not stay free forever. Kitsch esoteric images of the psychedelic landscape and illustrations hovered around, always ready to re-anchor an unmoored acid vision. And so Didrikson is referring to all of those psychedelic posters that one identifies with the 1960s, that suddenly, around which some notion of the psychedelic begins to cohere. And Didrikson references Michel Foucault's improbable LSD experience at Zabriskie Point with historian Simon Wade. And we're looking at Foucault at Zabriskie Point with Simon Wade. Didrikson wonders what it means to drop acid at this spot already psychedelically coded by the most hallucinatory scene in Michelangelo Antonioni's film, Zabriskie Point. The acid vision of this landscape is both decontextualized pure terrain and recognizable psychedelic object. So in a sense, a version of this psychedelic geography colors Esselin's therapeutic landscape. The vista of surging waves at Big Sur, the backdrop of meditation rituals, nude massages, and encounter sessions, was the perpetual object of contemplation that helped spark chemically enhanced consciousness. Like Zabriskie Point, the Big Sur landscape on acid both falls away from ordinary perception and congeals as a fixed object of psychedelic consciousness. Leary argued that because consciousness is biochemical, advanced consciousness could therefore be attained by chemical additions and adjustments. Just as telescopes and other new technologies have evolved to aid external vision, Leary claimed, so do new technologies such as LSD evolve for inner vision. The image of the Big Sur landscape made psychedelic, and Leary's inner vision converged to form Esselin's therapeutic and psychedelic sublime. But by the 1970s, Leary's psychedelic labor performed with chemical additives veered instead toward cleansing rituals and chemical recalibration. A generational fatigue with LSD, the 1970 Controlled Substances Act that classified narcotics into 5 classified stratified schedules. This is the beginning of the war on drugs. And the shifting politics of ecstasy impacted Esselin's practice of therapy. Here's Nixon signing in the... Here's Nixon signing in the Controlled Substances Act. And this period also saw notions of care and self-discovery elsewhere drift from narcotic chemicals toward an incipient culture of detoxification. At the Living Word Fellowship Center in San Francisco, for example, teenagers were encouraged to abandon acid as their source of cosmic insight for the high that Jesus offered. At other human growth centers, the psychedelic work of being on drugs was replaced with the labor of being off drugs and with a form of liberation gained through meditation and personal growth. So if the early Esselin at Big Sur and other countercultural resorts formalized drug use as a tool for expanding consciousness and opening the doors of perception, New Age retreats offered alternative avenues to enlightenment. Ecstatic contamination through LSD ceded to ecstatic purification through detoxification, diet, yoga, and a complex of therapies that substituted chemical ingestion with chemical recalibration. Just as one example, these are the Earhart training seminars from the 1970s, commonly known as EST or EST. And you can see something, but the scene of therapy and personal growth has, and the aesthetics of, I don't know, haircuts and bodies have changed drastically. Alongside this reformulation of personal growth and its therapies, the status of trauma, which was at the core of most of the psychological experiments at Esselin, departed from the purely personal or psychological to encompass the environmental. Notions of environmental injury, the effects of which the Ralph Nader Study Group described in the 1970s as a crime wave victimizing America's citizens, appeared ever more forcefully linked to aerial contaminants and pollutants. The Nader's group polemic claimed that these pollutants were a type of domestic chemical and biological warfare, implicitly linking the victims of smog attacks to victims of mustard gas, smoke bombs, and the napalm exported to Vietnam. As with these shifting clouds, the contours of an injurious environment fluctuated and expanded to encompass a broader notion of injury and victimization. Assessing the history of subjectification and the management of human conduct, Nicholas Rose refers to a passional economy in which subjects are identified by desires, pleasures, and disorders of excess. If the early Esalen promised liberation by channeling this economy, the conception of therapy at the detox clinics in Malibu and in growth centers of the early 1970s turned toward a restriction and limiting of its excesses. Recovery therapies stage an encounter with personal trauma, but also with the trauma and injury one has suffered through the immoderate engagement with chemicals. Yet just as the environmental chemical is understood to be injurious, drug addiction and disorders of excess are not only read as mismanagement of conduct or personal failure, but also by an environmental injury that expands well beyond the ecological. New forms of alienation, states of shock from financial precarity, and other ravages of capital compel attempts at narcotic compensation in lieu of narcotic liberation. Full detoxification then would mean encountering and coming to terms with this broad sense of cultural environmental injury. The Malibu Rehabilitation Centers attempt to respond to this expanded field of injury through their clinical disposition. At these centers, we see a magnification of our contemporary culture of therapy, and at the same time, a reconsideration of the identity, morality, and effects of contaminants. Here, personal growth, exercised against excess and against contemporary form of trauma and injury, simultaneously departs from and recalls the Esalen therapy revolution. Like the narcotic air over Italy and Los Angeles, the clinics still carry traces of a West Coast psychedelic disposition. They elaborate techniques of self-care in view of a landscape that oscillates between its everyday clinical use and its entrenched, anchored status as a psychedelic object. These clinics are then both animated and contaminated by a therapeutic psychedelic legacy that strobes with vestiges of early 1960s and 1970s retreats. This flashing back allows us to glimpse within the space of clinical therapy a history of altered perception organized into an economy of personal improvement. The circuit of toxins and detoxification shifts between psychedelic vision and a clinical sphere of cleansing and responsibility. It circles around and connects environmental degradation, the liberating promise of the molecular revolution, that was Leary's term, and the administration of consciousness. Thank you.
Mark, the next speaker will be Professor Sungook. Please welcome him. That was great.
Good morning. I am Sungook. Today, I am going to talk about a boy who was treated in the 1950s, Joey, and I would like to introduce the case of Joey, and I would like to reinterpret Joey's diagnosis with my presentation. In the 1950s, Bruno Bettelheim was a famous American psychiatrist, and he treated an autistic boy who was called Joey. And Joey withdrew completely from the world and started to believe that he himself was a mechanical robot. He could only sleep when connected to complex machines set up on his bed, and he could only live when connected to a machine. And through my presentation today and through the case of Joey, I would like to reinterpret how we can view his case. In the 1950s and 60s, humans and machines were always in opposition. So to apply a physics metaphor, if the sum of humanity and technicity is constant and doesn't change, if machines become more autonomous, humanity will necessarily suffer, was what people thought at that time. And Jacques Ellul said, there can be no human autonomy in the face of technical autonomy. And with regard to technology, Mumford said, instead of functioning actively as an autonomous personality, man will become a passive, purposeless, machine-conditioned animal. And Galbraith, an economist, said, we are becoming servants of the machine we have created to serve us. Let's go back to Joey. Bruno Bettelheim, who treated Joey, was the director of the Orthogenic School for Disturbed Children inside the University of Chicago, and he was Austrian, and he was a child psychologist and psychoanalyst. Between 1938 and 1939, he was interned in Dachau and Buchenwald in the concentration camps, and he was able to escape to the United States later on. And in the US, he wrote about his experience in the concentration camps, and he published a book, and this book became very famous. And he didn't have any degrees in psychology or psychoanalyst theory, but he became very famous in the US as a child psychologist and psychoanalyst. And later on, Bettelheim's theories were discussed and contested because he did not have any expert degrees. Actually, he had a PhD on art history, but he was not licensed as child psychologist. And through his students, we were able to learn that he was very strict with his students, and he sometimes abused his students. And when this was revealed later on, his theories were very contested. I'm not going to talk about this here today, though. And he was very criticized because he compared autistic children with the prisoners of concentration camps many times. And I just brought here a quote in English. Some victims of concentration camps had lost their humanity in response to extreme situations.
Before their humanity really develops. So could there be any connection, I wondered, between the impact of the two kinds of inhumanity I had known? One inflicted for political reasons on victims of a social system, the other, perhaps, a self-chosen state of dehumanization?이라고 이 둘의 이제 관계에 대해서 묻고 있고요. 예, 마지막 인용을 보시면은 therefore, to develop child schizophrenia, it is enough that the infant be convinced that his life is run by insensitive, irrational powers who had absolute control over his life and death. For the normal adult to suddenly develop schizophrenic-like reactions, this must be true, as it was in the concentration camps. So, 그러니까 그는
So, for Bettelheim, autistic children in front of irrational power or an absolute power, felt like they were prisoners. And there are wardens in concentration camps, and so these wardens control the prisoners and order the prisoners around, and parents were playing the role of wardens towards the children. And this is very disputed today, but he came out with the refrigerator mother theory. And he was the person who made the refrigerator mother theory popular. And in 1959, Joey's case was published in the Scientific American. Joey had a very cold mother, and his father also was not very interested in him, even after he was born. And according to Bettelheim, when Joey cried when he was a baby, his parents just let him cry. They didn't take care of him, and all they did was to feed him regularly during meal times, and they didn't give him love or care. And ultimately, Bettelheim said that by treating Joey mechanically, his parents made him into a machine. And on the left, this is a drawing that Joey drew at school. Joey was asked to draw himself, and this is how he drew himself. So he is somebody who is, he drew wires, he drew a box, drawing himself. So Joey loved complicated machines ever since he was little, and so he assembled them and disassembled them, and he installed tubes and motors and machines all around his bed, and he actually slept connecting his body to all of these machines, and he could only sleep when he was connected to the machines. And he had imaginary circuits, electric circuits all around him, and he believed that he could only live when energized by these circuits. And teachers and his friends had to be careful when walking around him because they had to, not step on the circuits and all the machines that he had installed around himself. And even when going to the toilet, he couldn't eliminate himself or have bowel movements on his own. He had to connect his body to tubes to be able to push and eliminate himself. And this is not a real tube, but this is an imaginary tube. He had to hold on to this imaginary tube to push. And Joey never called a person by name. And yet he gave names to all the machines that he made, and he named them. For example, one of his machines was called the Criticizer. And the criticizer was somebody who prevented him from feeling bad, who gave him peace of mind. And after making these complicated machines, he would say they explode. There's an explosion, and then he would break all of his machines and disassemble all of his machines. And Bettelheim said that Joey was showing that he had freed himself, liberated himself from the machine, recovering his humanity briefly, but then he continues to rebuild these complicated machines, meaning that he did not stay human for long, and that he returned to the state of being enslaved to the machine. In 1959, Joey's case was published in the Scientific American, and many people were able to read his case. And in 1967, Bettelheim wrote The Empty Fortress, Infantile Autism and the Birth of the Self. And in this book, which was very popular, Bettelheim writes in detail about Joey's case. And in this book, Bettelheim compares autistic children to prisoners in the Nazi concentration camps. And he says autistic children are the result of cold mothers or refrigerator mothers. When we read The Empty Fortress, we can see specific delusions and behaviors of autistic children. And this is kind of connected to the period in which Bettelheim lived. For example, during the Middle Ages, people did have delusions and talked about their delusions and illusions. But what they saw were in the form of humans, so they took human form. But with the modern times, many delusions and illusions were machines. And we see people seeing images of machines because we are living in the age of machines. This was what Bettelheim said. Man's delusion of a machine would be a token of our hopes and fears of what machines may do for us or to us. So, in the modern society, the modern man is afraid of machines. At the same time, they hope that machines will help us. And so we have delusions about machines more and more, and Joey was an example of that. And in order to prove his theory, after Joey came to the school and he improved little by little, and Bettelheim shows as evidence the drawings of Joey. In the first drawing, he was asked to draw his room and himself, and this is what he drew. And it's a very small room, and the child is completely isolated, and Joey is connected to a machine. And then after a while, we move on to the second picture, second drawing, and he has gotten much better. And the third drawing shows that he is greatly improved. And Bettelheim says in the first two drawings, Bettelheim says the room is the drawing of Joey's mother's fetus. And it's not just a human fetus, but it's a mechanical fetus. And inside the mechanical fetus, in the first and second drawing, the energy is received through wireless line. But in the third drawing, there is a wired line. So here, Joey is better connected to the outside world. And in the first and second picture, we see that there's a child in the middle, which is Joey himself, and the child is very close to the machine. But in the third drawing, the machine is far away and is on top. Of course, they're still connected, but the machine is at a distance, and the machine looks like a fan, looks like a motor, And more importantly, in the third drawing, there is a hand. We can see a drawing of a hand. And so Joey has drawn a hand which is controlling his environment. And so he is no longer passive, but inside the mechanical womb, thanks to the hand, he has become someone who can control his environment. That is the interpretation of Bettelheim. And then he shows us other drawings of Joey. And this is Joey's drawing of the car family. In the first drawing, the car is moving on its own, and there's no person in the car. The machine is completely autonomous, and it's the machine that dominates this car. And in the second drawing, after this drawing was drawn, after some time has passed, and we see a person in the car. But the car has this person sitting behind in the rear seat. And in the third drawing, we have the person who is completely controlling the car in front. The person is driving and controlling the car. And so these three drawings show and demonstrate Joey's growing autonomy. At first, the car was autonomous, and then the human being acquires the autonomy from the car, and the car becomes passive, whereas the passenger and the person becomes more active. And in the third drawing, Joey is completely cured, is what Bettelheim is saying through the interpretation of these drawings. And then, after Joey is cured, Joey starts to draw his first picture of nature. And Bettelheim says that we can read warm emotions and feelings in the drawings of Joey. And this is shown as evidence that Joey has gotten better. And this paper on Joey concludes as follows. When Joey was 12, right before he graduated from his school, he went to this school for 3 years, and he goes to a Memorial Day parade, and he holds a picket, and the picket reads this slogan: "Feelings are more important than anything under the sun." So feelings are of utmost importance is the slogan that Joey is holding on to. And Bettelheim says that Joey has learned that what made humanity is feelings, and their absence is a mechanical existence. And with this knowledge, Joey has entered into the human condition. And now, from now on, I would like to reinterpret Bettelheim's interpretation of Joey's case. Maybe we can read it a bit differently. Bettelheim demonstrates through the drawings of Joey his stronger self-identity and his improved self-esteem. And we see these drawings in more detail. And here we have the different machines. It looks like a fan, it looks like a radio, it also looks like a TV. And here we also have another apparatus on the right. It looks like a motor. And all these machines are connected with lines. And right in the middle, in the center, we have a boy, and the boy is holding on to these machines with his hand. Or the boy seems to be connected to all the lines. The interesting thing is that we can see organs and intestines inside the belly, stomach of the little boy. And underneath, we have a drawing which looks like he is relieving himself. And this doesn't look like a drawing of a fetus, but looks like a drawing of Joey going to the toilet to eliminate himself. As I told you before, Joey had to connect himself with an imaginary machine to be able to have bowel movements and to be able to poo. And in the third drawing, the interesting thing is it's the same machine. So there's the same machine in the second drawing, but They have not vanished completely, but they're very far away. And yet they're far away but connected to Joey's environment. And here we have a small box, and we don't know what it is. And inside the body, and on top of the body, we see organs inside that look like intestines. And Joey may have drawn a toilet, and he may be putting his hand on the toilet in order to relieve himself. So he has not regained his humanity by separating himself from a machine, but the machine here is maybe playing a different function, a different role in this drawing. I showed you this picture before, the 3 drawings of cars, and let's go back to these 3 drawings to see how they have evolved. The first car that Joey drew was interpreted by Bettelheim as being a car that was completely autonomous, where the human being is completely passive. But this is not a drawing of a car for me. It looks more like a street car, because underneath the car, Joey has written 110 volts. And we see the ground, the line that delineates the ground. And from this drawing of a streetcar, we can say that the fact that there is no driver is nothing strange, because usually when streetcars were circulating on the streets, the children couldn't see the driver in the streetcar anyway. The driver was always invisible. And this streetcar drawing and another drawing that Joey drew, if we compare the two, is very interesting. This is Joey's drawing of an electric hen. It's the hen electric drawing. So the hen and a car have converged together to become a car. And Bettelheim said that this was an electrical fetus. But if we look at the form and the shape of the drawing compared to the first drawing, it looks very much like the first drawing. So Joey mixed an animal and a streetcar and merged the two in this drawing. And this second drawing, Bettelheim says, is when the human appears as a passive entity. I'm not sure whether it's correct, because there are many cars that can be driven in this way. And what's interesting here is that the human being is very much connected, stuck to the car, very close to the car. And in the third drawing, this is a very interesting drawing. Bettelheim analyzes this drawing by saying the driver is in complete control of the car now, and now the human has become completely autonomous. And in this drawing, more interesting than that is the back seat, what happens behind the driver. We have many different systems here at the back. What does it look like to you? The back of the car. What does it look like to you? It's really hard to know and see. I asked my students what they thought it was, and they said, well, maybe he's torturing the rabbit. It looks like a picture of a rabbit being tortured. Maybe the rabbit is electrocuted and being tortured. But it looks like a bulb, a light bulb. And the energy source of the electric bulb is giving energy to the car to move. And when Joey was drawing this car, he had visited the Museum of Science and Technology of Chicago. And he went to the museum, and he was very interested in the incubation of an egg. And when he came home, he wanted to simulate himself laying an egg. And after drawing this drawing, he said that he had hatched an egg and that he had laid an egg and that he had been able to give birth to life after visiting the Museum of Science and Technology and seeing the artificial egg incubator. I think that here we see the artificial egg incubator in the back, and children could play with artificial egg incubators and play with the light bulbs, and they could maintain a certain temperature in order to help the eggs hatch. And so what we can see here is that the driver is much more autonomous, but more than that, by using the energy of the car, Joey was trying to explain that we could do new things and we could experiment with new things, and that thanks to the fusion of the human and machines, we can create something hybrid, something that is new, something that can give birth to a new kind of hybrid. Maybe we can interpret it in this way. So in conclusion, as I mentioned before, Bettelheim lived during a time when it was thought that machines destroyed our humanity. He thought that humanity and machines were in opposition, and this was because of his experience in Nazi concentration camps. Nazi concentration camp was considered to be a big machine, and inside this big machine, the human was helpless. And when the machine becomes too strong, we lose our humanity, was the natural conclusion of Bettelheim in his analysis. But after graduating from school, he visits the school again 3 years later, and he talks with Bettelheim. And this is the interview that Joey had with Bettelheim 3 years after leaving school. So Bettelheim asked Joey, "Why did you obsess so much about machines?" And Joey's answer is a bit strange. Joey says, "Well, I loved machines because machines had wings that could rotate, and it was a way of showing people that I was intelligent, and that was why I obsessed so much about machines." And Joey also said that he was afraid that if he said that he was a person and not a machine, that people would think that he was independent and that people would not take care of him anymore. And he said, "I can find many shapes in the world, and I can find all of these shapes in the machine parts, and that's why I was in love with machines," was Joey's answer. And so the confrontation or conflict, the struggle or paradox between humans and machines is something that Bettelheim is saying more than what Joey is saying. And so Bettelheim is saying human and machine cannot become one, but Joey is not saying that in his answer. So maybe the interpretation of Joey and his treatment was very subjective. And it's very hard to analyze this case because there is no record on Joey's case other than Bettelheim's analysis and Bettelheim's research. So we need to interpret this paper and reinterpret Bettelheim's text from a different perspective. But we live in an age where humanity and technicity are not contradictory. We are complementary. And by coming together, we can do new things that were impossible before. It opens up new possibilities. And so our situation is a little bit different from Bettelheim's time, so maybe we need to reinterpret Joey's case from this perspective. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for your wonderful paper. And now the next presenter is Hannah Proctor. Please welcome her.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation. It's great to participate in this symposium. My paper is called Mournful Militancy. Blessed are they that mourn. The image behind me, which I took from social media, was taken in London near the site of the Grenfell Tower fire. On June 14th, 2017, a fire broke out in a tower block in North Kensington, West London. It quickly spread. The rapid spread of the fire is thought to have been due to the cheap cladding added to the exterior of the building. Some have speculated it had been added to make cosmetic changes to the building's appearance, so as to make the area more attractive to wealthy prospective property buyers. The residents' organisation based in the flats had frequently raised safety concerns about the building and expressed anxieties about the quality of the renovations undertaken there. At least 80 people died in the fire, perhaps more. Though the residents of the building were mostly working class and most of the tenants were in social housing provided by the council, the tower was located in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, the richest in the country. The fire starkly and tragically revealed deep social inequities in British society, and very much racialised ones. I'm aware that I'm surrounded by experts on architecture, so I won't say much about the building or the fire itself, but I wanted to begin with this image. It was taken at a silent protest on October 14th, marking 4 months since the fire took place, protesting the failure of the local council to provide housing to survivors and many other failures besides. On the wall in the background is written, "Blessed are they that mourn." You can't quite see the rest of the line from the Bible. It should say, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." However, the inadequate political response to the crisis and the gross negligence that enabled such a catastrophe to occur in the first place obstruct the process of mourning. The heart-wrenching handwritten notes on the wall beneath the sign attest to the difficulty of survivors and others in the community to find any comfort. How to mourn, which implies the possibility of moving on from the original traumatic event in the face of such glaring social injustice. How to continue fighting for justice while grieving. This is the subject of my paper, in which I return to Douglas Crimp's essay, Mourning and Militancy. My background is as a historian of psychology and other psi disciplines, specifically histories of radical psychiatry, and including anti-psychiatry. I've also worked on Soviet psychiatry. This has usually involved working on professionalized and institutionalized forms of care, even in cases when such practices were antagonistic to mainstream institutions and paradigms. My new research, however, has shifted from professional to lay practices. I'm attempting to conceptualize a new project that attempts to think through different ways in which activist groups have understood and treated themselves in the aftermath of political struggles. The phenomenon I'm interested in could broadly be called burnout, although I'm wary of giving it a label because I'm not trying to claim that it's a transhistorical phenomenon. So, for example, communards who survived the Paris Commune of 1871 diagnosed themselves with nostalgia, whereas those involved in the October Revolution in Russia in 1917 described themselves as suffering from a malaise they named exhaustion. Although I'm not an expert on the historical period and political struggle Crimp engages with, I found myself returning to his essay again and again because I think it captures something of a tension common to radical political movements between the necessity to fight on the one hand and the necessity to heal psychically on the other. He also acknowledges that struggling to change society can be psychologically damaging in its own right, and that ignoring this can have potentially dangerous consequences for those involved in these struggles. Krimp's paradigm is psychoanalytic, but he revisits Freud's canonical definition of mourning and so reconceptualizes it in the process. In the essay Paranoid Reading and Reparative Reading, Eve Kosowski-Sedgwick stresses the importance of finding a vocabulary that can do justice to a wide, effective range, claiming that the term paranoia is a theory of negative affect which leaves open the distinctions between or among negative affects. According to Sedgwick, a disturbingly large amount of theory seems explicitly to undertake the proliferation of only one affect, or maybe two, of whatever kind, whether ecstasy, sublimity, self-shattering jouissance, suspicion, abjection, knowingness, horror, grim satisfaction, or righteous indignation. Her theoretical approach, she contends, is capable of attending to multiple contradictory or overdetermined affective states. But before outlining this approach, she caricatures, with her characteristically lacerating wit, various positions that exhibit a reductive approach to affect. This is a quote. "It's like the old joke, comes the revolution, comrade, everyone gets to eat roast beef every day. But comrade, I don't like roast beef. Comes the revolution, comrade, you'll like roast beef. Comes the revolution, comrade, you'll be tickled pink by those deconstructive jokes. You'll faint with ennui every minute you're not smashing the state apparatus. You'll definitely want to have hot sex 20 to 30 times a day. You'll be mournful and militant. You'll never want to tell Deleuze and Guattari, not tonight, dears, I have a headache." Assuming I'm not just being paranoid, among this avalanche of pithy dismissals is a jibe at Douglas Krimp's essay Mourning and Militancy, which was published in 1989. And that's the text that I've found myself returning to in my attempt to think about how activist communities have responded to forms of psychological damage and developed forms of psychological care within their milieu. Contra Sedgwick's satirical characterization of his understanding of affect as straitjacketed by a reductive binary, mourning and militancy, Krimp explicitly claims that a wide range of affective states accompany political movements and their aftermaths. He's not concerned simply with the seemingly contradictory coupling of mournfulness with militancy, but in attending to frustration, anger, rage and outrage, anxiety, fear and terror, shame and guilt, sadness and despair. Being a mournful militant consists precisely in acknowledging this litany of conflicting emotions. Following the unexpected death of his father, with whom he'd had a difficult relationship, Krimp recalls that he expressed no sorrow and soon resumed his regular routines. Weeks later, however, he developed a large abscess in his left tear duct, which eventually burst, spilling poisoned tears down his face, a symptom he interpreted as a physical manifestation of his repressed grief. "I have never since doubted the force of the unconscious," he writes, "nor can I doubt that mourning is a psychic process that must be honored." This personal anecdote attesting to the psychic tenacity of unprocessed loss is recounted in the opening pages of his essay, in which he confronts the seemingly oxymoronic relationship between his two eponymous concepts. Writing in the context of the AIDS epidemic in the USA and addressing his community of fellow AIDS activists he was involved with ACT UP, Krimp describes how mourning processes and rituals like candlelit vigils were frequently decried as anathema to militant political struggle, indulgent, sentimental, defeatist. So they were dismissed by those involved in the movement, conforming to a long-standing tendency of people, especially on the left, to equate processes like grieving with bourgeois individualism, and he makes this connection himself explicitly. As people in the gay community lost lovers and friends to the ravages of a devastating illness, the call was to fight for the living rather than to weep for the dead. But Krimp insists on the necessity of mourning within radical political communities and, more importantly, cautions against the dangers of not mourning. It is because our impatience with mourning is burdensome for the movement that I'm seeking to understand it, he writes. Krimp acknowledges that mourning, as canonically defined by Freud in Mourning and Melancholia, 1917, does indeed seem incompatible with political activism. For Freud, though a finite process, mourning is all-consuming, Freud says. It leaves nothing over for other purposes or other interests. Krimp frames his argument in relation to Freud's outline of the concept of mourning, but nonetheless acknowledges that normal mourning, in Freud's sense, is impossible within the context he is describing. According to Krimp, Freud's theory says very little about communal grieving rituals, nor does it address the possibility that such rituals could be socially obstructed, which is also the example of Grenfell, I think, points to this possibility of the kind of social obstruction of grief. Reality testing is central to Freud's discussion of mourning, through which the subject comes to acknowledge and eventually accept the loss of the loved object, consequently withdrawing or detaching their libido from it. But reality was not a neutral empirical backdrop in the context of the AIDS crisis because of American society's ruthless interference with bereavement, and because loss was not a fact of the past to come to terms with and move on from, but remained a possibility for the future, Krimp writes, whether we share this fate is so unsure. Very real anxieties about mortality thus pervaded the movement. In the face of social and political barbarism and the enforced silencing of grief within a hostile, homophobic and callous society, Krimp declares that mourning becomes militancy. Except his argument doesn't end there. Though sympathetic to the transformation of sorrow into anger, he claims that because this process only takes place on a conscious level, it leaves unconscious antagonisms unresolved. Militancy, in this sense, can't function as a substitute for mourning, but instead results from the socially enforced disavowal of grief. Poisoned tears remain unwept. In this sense, militancy represses mourning, or this is the risk that he sees in kind of trying to downplay the need to mourn. Krimp complicates and reconceptualizes Freud's definition of mourning by calling into question the notion that mourning can be accomplished by deferring to reality. Instead, he insists that the subject must engage in a process that attempts to survive within the external world without accepting it, while also being attentive to the damaging qualities of internal unconscious processes. And both of these things are really ongoing. In this redefinition, mourning no longer entails a respect for reality, which is Freud's term, but involves interrogating and reconfiguring both external and internal realities. Krimp also implicitly challenges Freud's statement that in mourning there is nothing about the loss that is unconscious. But though he identifies a certain melancholic, self-doubting disposition in the AIDS activist community, he refuses to follow Freud in defining melancholia as pathological. Nor does he claim that this affective state results from a fully unconscious relationship to the lost object. He's refusing. In Freud's definition, Freud says melancholia behaves like an open wound, and it's defined specifically as pathological, whereas I think because Krimp's interested in locating some of the problems outside the subject in society, he refuses this kind of pathological reading, even if he does maintain there's a kind of ongoingness. Krimp discusses the gross political negligence that contributed to exacerbating the AIDS epidemic and addresses the psychic damage inflicted by a homophobic society which delegitimized experiences of bereavement and blamed, belittled, excluded, derided the gay community rather than offering empathy, support, or adequate health care. And again, I think you see a kind of parallel with the situation in Grenfell where the political response has been so wanting. Yet he warns against carving too neat a dichotomy between the external and the internal, the social and the psychological. Yes, he says, the world is violent and unjust, and this brutality and injustice must be combated. However, violence is not only located outside the subject in a hostile society, but also operates on an internal unconscious level. And I think part of the point is a temporal one. Even if you manage to make a change in the present society, you're never going to undo the fact that the original event happened. So on some level, it won't ever be fully resolved. No single line can be plotted that moves inexorably from external violence, cause, to internal misery, effect. Instead, suffering might better be understood as resulting from ongoing conflicts between the social and the psychological, which are always mutually constituted and whose origins are never located in a single time or place. Violence, he says, is also self-inflicted. For Crimp, focusing solely on transforming the external world through militant action does nothing to resolve the corrosive effects of unconscious processes, at least not on their own. Here he cites Jacqueline Rose's discussion of a disagreement between Freud and Wilhelm Reich concerning the origins of misery, which echoes a passage in Sexuality in the Field of Vision, her book which was published just a few years before Crimp's essay, where she identifies a long-standing tendency for left-wing theorists seeking to politicize psychoanalysis to imagine that a clean distinction can be made between psychic and social processes, and which thus attempts to kind of dispense with the unconscious in the process. Quote, historically, whenever the political argument is made for psychoanalysis, this dynamic is polarized into a crude opposition between inside and outside, a radical Freudianism always having to argue that the social produces the misery of the psychic in a one-way process, which utterly divests the psychic of its own mechanisms and drives, end quote. Following Rose's insights, Crimp insists that locating all negative feelings in the external world only serves to compound psychological antagonisms and experiences of suffering. He says, by making all violence external, we fail to confront ourselves, to acknowledge our ambivalence, to comprehend that our misery is also self-inflicted. As such, Crimp insists that activists should be able to acknowledge feelings of frustration, anger, rage and outrage, anxiety, fear and terror, shame and guilt, sadness and despair, to repeat the list that I read before, and also attend to experiences of those who feel only a deadening numbness or constant depression, who are paralyzed with fear, filled with remorse, or overcome with guilt. Those for whom coherent expressions of anger in the form of explicit political action may be impossible. This, however, entails a more expansive understanding of militancy rather than a rejection of it. Caring for remorseful and withdrawn friends and comrades is a form of political practice that should not displace, but rather be combined with more public or combative forms of resistance. Crimp concludes his essay with a demand for militancy that acknowledges the necessity of mourning. Quote, the fact that our militancy may be a means of dangerous denial in no way suggests that activism is unwarranted. There is no question that we must fight the unspeakable violence we incur from the society in which we find ourselves. But if we understand that violence is able to reap its horrible rewards through the very psychic mechanisms that make us part of that society, then we may also be able to recognize, along with our rage, our terror, our guilt, and our profound sadness. Militancy, of course, then, but mourning too. Mourning and militancy. End quote. Crimp's use of the conjunction "and" in the essay's title and in this closing line risks suggesting that mourning and militancy remain distinct but parallel processes, which is maybe part of Sedgwick's critique, I guess. Whereas the essay Mourning and Militancy actually reconceptualizes both terms. It concludes by advocating a kind of mournful militancy, a militancy that can be expressed in numerous affective registers: grief and anger, care and sadness, collectivity and withdrawal, and one which attends to psychic wounds while simultaneously attempting to radically transform society. Few political movements have contended with death in an analogous manner to the activism that responded to the AIDS crisis. But Crimp's argument is nonetheless useful for thinking about a tendency for piety and moralism within other activist milieux. Indeed, he makes this connection himself, citing the famous phrase of labour organiser Joe Hill, "Don't mourn, organise." He clearly outlines a recurrent tendency within radical political movements to dismiss negative emotions as detrimental to a collective cause, or to characterize anxiety, suffering, despair, and introspection as self-indulgent and apolitical. Yet the recurrence, which recalls what Freud describes as laments which always sound the same and wearisome in their monotony, suggests that such experiences persist and need to be acknowledged. Following Freud, Crimp is also explicit that the mourning processes he is considering do not solely apply to the literal dead, but also to the death of ideals. In his case, the death of the promise of uninhibited sexual expression. It's this latter form of mourning that might most generatively be thought in relation to the aftermath of other historical moments or movements, perhaps, although, of course, actual corpses, often those of people killed at the hands of the state, are not absent from other political movements and their histories. Assuming people's political ideals are not crushed along with their movements, the immediate past of defeat is not only something to be worked through and left behind, but memories of solidarity and shared conviction might also give hope and even shape to the future. I just want to conclude by returning to the image, "Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted." In Simone Weil's Gravity and Grace, a book which was compiled posthumously by a priest named Gustave Thibon, with whom she was friends and to whom she'd entrusted her notes, he mentions this line in a footnote and expresses concern that her pronouncement disagrees with the sentiment expressed in the Bible. She writes, "Human misery would be intolerable if it were not diluted in time. We have to prevent it from being diluted in order that it should be intolerable. And when they had had their fill of tears, this is another way of making the worst suffering bearable. We must not weep, so that we may not be comforted." Weil is asserting that so long as suffering exists, individual consolation or amelioration is impossible. Mourning processes cannot be completed as long as injustice is ongoing. But Crimp's essay, on the other hand, attempts to find a way to weep that wouldn't necessarily lead to comfort, or at least might involve a kind of modicum of comfort that's combined with a refusal to accept the broader situation or to make that situation bearable. It's a kind of a slightly less uncompromising position than Weil's. The situation is intolerable, but we need to find ways of mourning within it if it is ever to change. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for an incredible set of papers. I'm going to try to respond in some way to the really excellent contributions, but also in many ways different. I thought maybe one could attempt to bring them to domesticity in some way. All three of them, in a way, can be related to this question, I think. I mean, I'm going to bring you back to the bed again, like in the argument of yesterday. Starting perhaps with Mark Wasiuta. I mean, it's very hard for me to think about, to listen to you without thinking about the parallel rise of sanatoria, not just for tuberculosis, but mainly for the nerves, in the context of this malaise that Hannah talked about, of the turn of the century with regard to the cities. And the Purkersdorf, for example, outside Vienna, where all the intelligentsia of Vienna, all the great musicians, Somber and Mahler, but also great writers like Hugo von Hofmannsthal, and even architects, the architects of the building, Colomon, Moser, and Hofmann are checking themselves into this, really extraordinary, that gives rise to a new kind of space. So in one sense, one could think about the sanatory for the nurse movement of the turn of the century, very much in connection to the detox clinics that you are talking about. And if one can see in the architecture of the early sanatorium how extraordinarily influential they were in the development of modern architecture, one question that I have for you is if you see in the movement, in the extraordinary movement, what do you say, 12,000 detox clinics in California? The numbers were staggering.
Yeah, the
right?
numbers are astonishing. Yeah,
right,
12,000.
Right.
Yeah,
12,000. Right. So in the middle of this, you have this kind of idyllic Californian houses, right, which only can house like 6 people. So I'm struck by this domesticity, which is linked to an enormous outside, this air full of drugs, but also this global pandemic of addiction. So there is this contrast, I think, between this domestic interior and a vast outside. And I think what comes out absolutely extraordinarily well through your paper is this question of addiction not being just about the individual body, but about an addiction, in a way, economy, right? $1 billion economy producing these drugs. I mean, the Sackler family was on the news last week, has been completely behind the rise of Oxycontin, etc. And $1 billion economy also trying to treat it with all these detox clinics, to prevent it, to police it, etc. So these two realms of the domestic, I mean, I guess there are 2 questions there. One is the relationship between this and the early 20th century, and whether you see any implications for architecture. And the other is more what I see the thread in between the 3 papers, which is connected to the domesticity. But maybe I can later talk about the other papers, perhaps. So
sure.
If you want to respond.
I'll try. Those are tough questions. And it's well, they are because Beatrice is like the perfect reader of this paper. Like, it's impossible to even think about this without hearing your work on the sanatoria in the background. But everything that you say in that work on the sanatoria and the development of the fenêtre en longueur, like there's like such serious architectural implications. And I suppose with the detox centers, especially the ones in Malibu, this is the curiosity. I went there expecting that there would be a kind of, what I call the clinical disposition would be somehow enacted more forcefully spatially. I expected these to be like the birth of the detox clinic, like in Foucault's sense, in the Malibu Hills. But it turns out it's this strange accommodation of therapy practices within very constraining bylaws and zoning regulations. And so the architecture of the modernist sanatoria meet something else. They meet something like the plateau of luxury accommodation. And so the clinical disposition, or the birth of the California clinic, is within that negotiation. And so there's something about that fascinated me. And so I don't know that it delivers something consequential in the way that the sanatoria did architecturally, but I think they also reveal, even within all of those spatial, conceptual, therapeutic constraints, I think, as I tried to make clear, even in their relatively luxurious poverty, if we can call it that, their luxurious architectural poverty, there's this incredibly interesting echo with a long history of therapeutic spaces, much like the ones you've mentioned. And so part of what I was trying to do was figure out how we see the signs of that echo, like what allows us to see what I was calling that strange flashing. And I think, to continue that work, one would have to talk about all of the spaces that you're talking about, the strange convergence of therapy practices, notions of health, and some European version of the human potential movement, right? The idea that the space and the therapy, and in the Esalen case, the drug can combine not only to make you feel better, but to make you a better cognitive agent than you would be previously, and not only a better cognitive agent, but a more creative cognitive agent. And so somehow trying to find the architectural role in all of that is pretty fascinating. But you don't, at least I didn't find any kind of functional relationship. All I found was that. All I found was the flashback as the sign of that efficacy.
Yes. No, it's super interesting. Maybe we can move on down, because I'm sure there are a lot of people that have other questions. I was also super fascinated with your paper, Sungook. Likewise, I somehow start thinking about the bed again and about domesticity. There is very much a domestic scene. You start the paper with this discussion of this boy that cannot sleep. He cannot sleep in the room. He has to imagine that the room and the bed is a machine, that he himself is a machine, that he's only sleeping when he's inside this machine. So for me, there is also this domestic scene at the heart of this discussion of post-human ecology. And I wanted to see whether you could or you would like to respond in some way to this question. So in many ways, that's how I connect the three papers, this domestic scene at the center of a much bigger kind of outside. It's not really a question, it's perhaps a comment, but maybe you want to elaborate a little bit.
I was listening to the interpretation, and you're talking about domesticity. What do you mean by domesticity? I'm not sure about what it means.
It's at all levels in your paper. It starts with the scene of the bed, the drawings of Joy, the house, the domestic scene. They don't take care of him. They take care in this way. The drawings of the Joy of the uterus, another form of domesticity.
Oh, domesticity.
Even the car, the family, the so-called family car, is kind of a domestic space.
Yeah. What?
There is a drawing I didn't show you today. We asked Joey to draw a house, the house where he lived, and he drew a picture of his house. And what was interesting in that drawing was, usually when we ask children to draw their house, we have the top, and they draw the roof, the top, and then some rooms, and then trees next to the house. And usually that's what they draw. But in the case of Joey, instead of the spaces that people can see, he was drawing the unseen spaces. The basement area, for example, was drawn much more in detail, spatially speaking. And it was very complex and complicated and drawn in detail, very mechanically. And we could see all the mechanical systems that were usually not very visible to the eye. And maybe we can interpret this in many different ways, but usually our way of life is also very similar. The space that we experience that is visible exists, but there are many more areas that are invisible that we cannot see. That's also true for the stage. We see the stage, but behind the stage we have machines that are there to help us show things on the stage. And areas and spaces that usually people are not that interested in or focused on. And for Joey, his house was drawn through the invisible spaces. So it can take different forms, but this is one example. And Bettelheim, Joey's doctor, interpreted Joey's drawing in the following way. Joey is drawing a sewage system. He is obsessed with a sewage system, and he is interested in the sewage system because of his bowel movements, because of his elimination needs. And he was interpreting it in a very Freudian way and analyzing the child in a very Freudian way. But on the other hand, maybe we can think, when we look at the city, for example, in the urban space, there are many infrastructures that are not visible to the eye, that we cannot see. And so the fact that the kid focused on something that was invisible, maybe we can interpret it in this way.
Super interesting, the analysis of this drawing. So it's not only he understands himself as a machine, but the whole house is a digestive mechanism that will connect. We could connect to theories of architecture as well. Quite interesting. Thank you very much. Hannah, in your case, first you mentioned a little bit far the issue of domesticity, except that in my view you are also describing a very personal, specific negative feeling, which is grief, as a public form of political activism. And I think that's super important and interesting. Yesterday we talked about play and activism, but now we are talking about mourning. And activism, and I think there is also really there is a question about domesticity here too. There is a beautiful exhibition now in New York. It may have closed by now, called AIDS at Home. Have you seen it?
No.
No, it focuses. You know how all the exhibitions on work on AIDS focus mostly on the public activism, and this is all identifying all the struggle that went on in the home. So all the AIDS protests focuses on the grief, but also the mobilization of the domestic, which is very much part of the. For example, think about the covering of the bed. That then becomes the covering of the quilt. You know, the quilt that becomes the covering of the national mall. So there is also this play. I mean, which I see in all three papers, from the bed to the national protest. And I thought your last point about mourning not just being for the people that die, but also for the death of ideals. It was a really important point to make. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't explicitly think about it in terms of domesticity, but when Mark was speaking, I was thinking about the Todd Haynes film Safe, which stars Julianne Moore as this kind of bourgeois LA housewife who's basically allergic to modern existence or something, but also very central to it is her home and her relationship with her husband. And I don't know, I was thinking about the kind of domestic space and how that's also related to her later kind of rehabilitation, and how these spaces are kind of, I don't know, make her sick in a way, but also that it is a model of rehabilitation that's built on kind of reintegrating into an existing system, however much that might be the thing that's making you ill, or that's at least the implication in the film, which is quite an ambiguous film in some ways, that it doesn't, you know, it leaves the viewer to kind of make these connections. It doesn't make them too. But I was thinking about that. But in relation to some of my own work, I think one of the things that I've found really disorientating in moving from more institutionalized or professionalized forms of psychiatry and psychology is a kind of spatial one, actually, because I've been working on a group called Red Therapy, who are British activist group who kind of developed their own forms of like therapy, basically, in relation to, in response to their own experiences of being kind of exhausted by political activism. And the spaces there are very interesting because they're basically like working in domestic spaces, but mostly in squatted buildings. And it's very much of this kind of improvised, constantly, very sort of haphazard use of space. which I found really, really interesting because it's such a kind of difference from what I'm used to thinking about. But I've also been thinking about, I guess, like you said, the kind of domestic spaces as part of political activism in a sense. I mean, in my PhD is on sort of the Soviet context, and there, you know, the kitchen table features very heavily as the sort of the space for kind of dissident activity. And I think you also have this sense. I've worked a little bit on the kind of histories of British and American communist parties, and there you also have this real emphasis on the kind of very small spaces in.
Thank you. So maybe you can ask questions of each other before we open to the public, if you have them. But you want to respond? So?
I don't know. I mean, I just feel like every architecture introductory course now has to start with Joy, the mechanical boy. I feel like there's no way we should read Rainer Banham without Joy. I don't know, but I would love to hear more about the dissident space, because just as my foray into what is clearly your realm of expertise is that correlation between how spaces are made therapeutic and one how identifies them, and I think I understand something about how that works institutionally within broad themes, but that one would be able to counter that by defeating a kind of the conventions of therapeutic spatialization. So we could say that the house is one of, classically that's what it is. It's the house that forms you as a kind of oppressive mechanism of therapy. So I'd just be curious to hear more about how one counters that by claiming a kind of dissident domestic operation.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting parallel because the spaces you were talking about are also repurposed houses, right? Yeah. So you do have a kind of interesting parallel. There's an example, a film called Asylum that was made in the early 70s of this radical kind of psychiatric community in London, in North London, which is just in a normal kind of terraced house, which I don't think was a squat. They paid rent there. And it was associated with R.D. Laing, the kind of famous British anti-psychiatrist. And there's a film about that space, and so much of the theory is about kind of how bad the family is, right? So you have the kind of, the domestic space is so sort of loaded, and they very like explicitly, like there's lots of shots of them like with sledgehammers, like breaking through the walls between the kitchen, but then obviously they still have to eat and generally sleep and do things in the space. So in some ways, it's a kind of, they've also painted on the walls, and I think there's a sort of deliberate sense in which they're trying to refuse the kind of. I mean, obviously the way the house is plumbed or like very basic things dictate like they eat in this room or they use this room as a bathroom. But they're trying, I think, there's a definite like quite performative sense in which the inhabitants who they're not conceptualized as patients or doctors, they're just kind of co-inhabitants of this space. For them, like, breaking down the walls very literally and writing on the, like, it's really important, I think, in terms of how they're trying to position themselves in antagonism to the society. But then you have all these quite funny interactions with the outside world where, like, the milkman comes and is just like, oh, as in it's still a house on a residential street. So I don't know, it's kind of an interesting way that they...
Right. Should we open it up, or you want to say something? Yeah, so of course.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yeah,
So at that time, when detoxing, you were trying to cure the body and at the same time trying to treat and cure the mind. And this was the type of treatment that people were getting at the time. But
공기 상태가 상당히 안 좋거든.
I don't know if you know about this, but Seoul is also suffering from bad air. We have minute particles that make the air terrible. People are very worried about this, and they want to know how to resolve this issue, because these substances are chemically very harmful to the body. And we want to look at ways to minimize the amount of minor particles in the air. We usually approach this technologically. For example, people will place air purifiers in the home, or they think we should regulate diesel fueled cars. But in the 60s and 70s, there were some cultural phenomena that took place in California. And what we see happening in Seoul is quite different from the approach taken by California in the 60s and 70s. Is it because of the time difference, or do you think it's because of the geographic difference? Have you ever thought about this?
Yeah, well, no, I haven't thought about Seoul specifically, because I would like to. You know, we've worked on a series of projects that attempt to think about the history of air in Los Angeles and what that might mean, to think of air as a cultural object as opposed to a cipher of something natural. And so that's part of what led me to this project, was to think about the way the contaminant and the particulate become an object of consciousness. The particulate becomes a cultural object at some point, and it's treated differently, and it's subjected to different modes of recording, analysis, and interpretation, but also it becomes a political object and a social object in interesting ways. And so when I was looking at the weird convergence of drug detoxification, part of this is to try to understand what the, as I hinted at very briefly today, what notions of injury are in relationship to environmental damage and injury in relation to consumption and ingestion of other chemicals. And you find really interesting alignments, whether they're, I think you'd be hard-pressed to say that they're conditioned by the same forces or driven by anything other than something like the coming into visibility of the contaminant as a more forceful cultural agent. And so it would not surprise me at all that the way people think about air and air quality and air particulate is much different here than and now than it was in California in the 60s. Just as a slightly different story, which might say something about this difference. We were invited to Mexico City to look at the history of the smog of Mexico City, and we expected to discover a narrative much like the one we found in California, which was the burgeoning of a kind of ecological consciousness in the 60s that produced pressure for governmental action and produced complex aesthetic interpretations of the particulates, because of course you see that through the 60s and 70s as well. It's not just scientific, it's especially LA's air becomes, you see it registered in photography projects and in sculptural projects. But it turns out in Mexico City that when they hosted the Olympics, the IOC was concerned about air quality, but the response from the Mexican government was one almost, you see this in the exchange with the IOC, almost a pride, which is that contaminated air, smog, is a sign of advanced industrialization. And, and so they didn't see this as a problem at all. What they saw this as a sign of them entering. Exactly, it's a kind of token of success. And even though there were dissident scientists who understood, because they were reading what was happening elsewhere, that this was a massive ecological and public health problem, it wasn't until almost the late 80s that this was received as an idea that could produce some kind of response. And so, which is just to say, I have no idea exactly what the history of Seoul is in relationship to its pollution, but this thing that we call air urbanism has its own vectors and differences and forces acting on it. So I imagine that Seoul's air urbanism is radically different than elsewhere, even though the pollutant operates on us the same way and is as noxious and as harmful as elsewhere. How one produces that as a discursive object, I think, has its own history everywhere.
I think it's super interesting, the history of that obsession, also kind of bringing it again back to architecture.
Yeah.
If you think, for example, about the Smithson's House of the Future,
Right,
the whole
yeah.
house is a mechanism of the contamination from the outside world, to the point that one of the things that the house includes is this thing that is very mysteriously labeled like unbreathed, this column of unbreathed air, but the whole house is a mechanism for, and this, I guess, is what I was trying to push a little bit later, because of course, you know, I'm sure it's happening all over the world, but in the United States there are all these communities of the environmental sensitive, so we have become allergic to our own creation, to our own environment, and in a kind of interesting replay of the 60s, there are tons of people living in the deserts and in these kind of bubbles that in which everything is the air is not contaminated by anything, but they are also super mobile, because at the whiff of any kind of new factory or a detergent or some body, then they move. So in many ways, in an echo of the 1960s drag induced.
They're kind of nomadic breathing communities.
Nomadic breathing. So I think it's a fascinating topic, but I'm trying to push it more into kind of historical thing, because I thought it was very interesting how you connected the detox clinics of today with the 60s, and not just detox clinics where people go from a particular form of intense kind of addiction, but in a way we are all in that situation, and it's having an effect in the ways we think about architecture and space and our cities. Right? Anyway, I'd like to open it to other people, because I'm sure you are so fascinated as I was with these three papers. So who has the first question? Okay, Mark.
I just wanted to learn more about the refrigerator mother. Because I mean, the refrigerator mother sounds. That's more of a machine. I mean, that's
Yes.
the refrigerator mother would be more extreme than Joey.
It only makes sense that Joey is a robot boy.
심리학을 하는 사람들에게는 잘 알.
I think a lot of psychologists are very familiar with this term. Leo Kanner, I believe, who was a child psychiatrist, first talked about the refrigerator mother, and it came out in the 1940s. And in the 1950s and 60s, it became very popular, a very popular concept. And on one hand, it was Gregory Bateson, who was influenced by cybernetics, linked it to the double bind theory. Double bind theory means when you send two conflicting messages to one person, then it's very confusing. And with these conflicting messages, this person can become schizophrenic. And it's a theory that explains schizophrenia. And at the time, child autism was categorized and used with the same meaning as child schizophrenia. So autism and schizophrenia was caused when the mom sends two conflicting messages to the child. The mom says, I love you, and at the same time beats the child or hits the child or scolds the child. Then the child is very confused because the mom will hit the child and then say, I love you, and keep on repeating this process. And in this way, the child is unable to understand these conflicting messages and becomes autistic or is hit with schizophrenia. And the refrigerator mother theory, if we interpreted it differently, usually in a home we have the father and the mother, and for whatever reason, the dad could be very indifferent to the child or uninterested. And when the mom cannot control the father, the mother can be very cold and not show love to the child. The child would like the mother to love him or her, but if the mother is cold to the child, then the child, to escape from this situation, becomes autistic. All the conditions of autism appear because of the refrigerator mother. And Anti-Fortress, written by Bettelheim, really spread the message of the refrigerator mother. But when the Empty Fortress came out, many critics were criticizing the refrigerator mother theory. And basically, the critics were saying child autism is genetic. It's genetic, so it doesn't stand. Autism is something that is genetic. It has nothing to do with the behaviors of parents or the attitude of parents. That was what the critics were saying. Nevertheless, many refrigerator mother theories came out later, and in Europe and in France later on, the existing refrigerator mother theory was a bit changed and transformed. And even in Korea today, many people, believe in the refrigerator mother theory.
Is there any? Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I watched a movie called Silence a long time ago. This film is about a priest house. Silence, however, we have to ask whether it comes from a sad emotion or a happy emotion. If you look at the two emotions, happy and sad, silence is a different type of silence from the Catholic house. And the priest house has in its center a kitchen where wonderful food is made. The priests maintain silence. However, the important factor here is food. In the priest house during the Middle Ages, we could always find good wine and good fish. They used to make good wine and good fish. So the priest house is served as a center of production. However, silence, is it emotion that is mournful, or is the silence something that represents deep contemplation? I'd like to ask you this question. And since you talked about architecture, I'd like to say that there is a certain sanctity of the kitchen in the monastery. Can you comment on this as well?
It's for me. I think the film in English is called Integrate Silence. Is that right? I think I know the film you mean. That's a very interesting question. I guess it would depend on what the motivation for the people. I don't think there's a kind of universal emotion that you can associate with that space, because I imagine it very much depends on people's motivations for entering that kind of space in the first place, and I imagine that that's very different in the Middle Ages and now, and in also different places in the world. So I find it difficult to generalize. I'm sure that there are interesting kind of ethnographic studies of the kinds of emotional responses produced by those kinds of spaces and the routines and rituals. But I wouldn't want to myself make any definitive claims. But I think it's interesting to think about the kinds of activities that take place in those spaces that are not just the kind of the prayer or yeah. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't feel like capable of making a definitive statement about the kind of emotional content of those spaces. Yeah. But interesting to think about.
Okay, thank you very much for all your presentations and for the wonderful comments. I think we are being asked to finish here.
네, 너무 흥미로운 주제였어가지고.
Yes, it was a very interesting session, so we had many questions. Now it's lunchtime, and we will return after lunch for the last and third session. And then after this symposium, we have a reception with wine, and you can go to the speakers directly and ask your questions then, if you have any. I would like to thank Professor Colomina and all of our three speakers. We are now going to end session 2 on psychopathology. We will take a lunch break until 2:25. After lunch, at 2:25, we will start session 3 on plasticity. We ask for your active participation. Thank you.